Hello everyone. This is a presentation regarding language analysis for a GCSE English language qualification, with particular focus being placed on the ability to zoom into words which are already within an existing phrase, which is something sometimes students tend to overlook. So sometimes you will get a phrase which is useful, but there are also words within that phrase which you can pick out and talk about on their own. So that's the point of this presentation. For the purposes of this presentation, I'll be using the Aberfan AQA exemplar paper, which some of you might be familiar with because it's been around now for about 4 or 5 years, and you might have used it for mocks or just to practice paper 2. So I won't be using source B of this paper, which is about an earthquake in London, because it's not actually the focus of the language question. I will just be referring to source A. Just to give some context, and I've put there that context for an English language qualification isn't necessarily essential, but it can be helpful to consider in order to go about answering the reading section questions. So I've got there 2 images, as you can see, which is all about the Aberfan disaster, what it looked like in the aftermath of it. Which happened in October 1966, and what happened was in a traditional mining village like Aberfan, the homes were built by mines, so the workers didn't have far to travel, and the mines created a lot of waste because it involves a lot of digging, and they put all this waste in piles of coal. You can see there at the top of that left-hand image, which looks a bit like mountains, really, man-made mountains. And because of heavy rain, the coal of this particular pile of coal, number 7, tip 7, was loosened and made unstable, and gravity meant that the pile of coal slid down the side of the mountain with tremendous speed and crushed many of the homes and the school as well in the village. And you can see there 116 children and 28 adults were killed on that day. So many children because it destroyed the primary school. So that's the reason why there were so many child fatalities, because it destroyed the primary school. And you can see there from the right-hand picture the height of the coal tip, which was 111 feet at the top of the mountain, came as high as some people's roofs of their homes. So you can see that if you're in the path of that, you are not going to be able to escape it very easily, if at all. So it was a huge post-war tragedy, and a sign or a symbol, I suppose, of a national mourning, as the reality of what had happened became clear. So even though context isn't essential for you in terms of writing about the historical or social context of the extract, like you would maybe with a literature qualification, it is still helpful to think about context, because this kind of mood is obviously going to be very sombre, very poignant, and you would therefore expect the writer to create that same kind of mood through the language and the phrases that they used. So that is the context. So just to show you the question, paper 2 question 3, which is out of 12 marks, lines 27 to 40, so you're looking at the second half of the source A extract. How does the writer use language to describe the coal tips? And we're only really interested, at least for the purposes of this presentation, on what I've highlighted there. The newest tip, number 7, was a killer with a rotten heart. So that is the phrase that we are only going to be looking at for this presentation. So we need to imagine that that is a phrase that you would want to use in answer to the question, which is all about the description of these piles of coal. And we are going to look at tip 7 in particular. And in specifically, that phrase was a killer with a rotten heart. So in the exam, a student might want to quote the whole of that phrase because it's relevant. But sometimes what they will forget to do is maybe zoom into that phrase and look at words specifically which are inside of that phrase. So to go into a little bit more detail with that, on a phrase level, we could call that phrase personification, because the pile of coal is being personified as having a heart that's rotten, and obviously a pile of coal doesn't have a heart. So you could almost say that it is personified, but you could also say it's a metaphor, because the pile of coal is being compared to a killer, which clearly, in terms of a person, it isn't. However, on a word level, We could zoom into the adjective rotten, but we could also look at the noun killer. So on a word level is what we're really going to be focusing on for this presentation. Let's say you've called it personification or you've called it a metaphor, but you can also then further it by then zooming into that phrase and talking about individual words as well. So if we think about this phrase in particular, again, if you have watched my other video about language, you will know that it's a very premature thing maybe to go straight into writing something. It's always a good idea to think about or to discuss or to jot down some ideas beforehand, which you then will use as your source of your paragraph, really. So we have two words here that I'm going to look at, killer and rotten, both of which have particular connotations, both of which can help you further your points. So to look at the red word first, killer, we're going to call that a noun. And if we think about what that word is, someone who has capacity to cause great harm, maybe a murderer, a destroyer, a menace, lack of empathy or compassion, extremely dangerous, malicious, sinister, malevolent, evil, violent, forceful, causing destruction and death, predatory, threatening. So some of you, for example, might watch crime documentaries on television where they interview serial killers, usually in America. And these are the kind of connotations of those people because they represent a threat because of the crimes that they have committed. But also, obviously, killers, wherever they are. But also adjective rotten. Again, there's a reason why the writer has decided to use that adjective in the context. Remember, they're not describing a person, they're describing a pile of coal. So adjective rotten, something that is decayed, decomposed, morally corrupt, something that's of a poor standard or quality, uncaring, putrid. That's quite a nice word, putrid. Well, nice word to say rather than what it actually is about. And I put there in brackets a heart. If you think of the symbol of a heart is a symbol of love. It's a symbol of affection or compassion. But here, this coal tip doesn't have a healthy heart full of love. It has a rotten heart, as if it's got evil intentions. So once we have now labelled these two words, we then have got a pretty good idea of what the writer wanted us to think about this pile of coal specifically. And that's when we can start to put it together in a paragraph. So I'm going to go through kind of 5 components to a paragraph and go through these one by one. So you can see how taking into account each of these 5 steps almost enables you to write a detailed paragraph. So number 1, we're going to start by mentioning the phrase level device. So we're going to call this phrase a metaphor. Then we're going to contextualize it in terms of what is that phrase doing. Then we're going to zoom into the words rotten and heart in more detail, linking it always to the coal tip so we're answering the question and therefore what we're saying is relevant. Number 4, we're going to make it explicit how readers feel about the coal tip because of the way it's described and the way in which the writer chooses to depict it. And then 5, in order to push it up even further into the mark scheme, we're going to finish with some evaluation. We're going to say how effective the phrase is in doing what it's supposed to do, which is depict this coal tip and its intentions. So number 1, start by mentioning the phrase or the device of the phrase. So the writer uses a metaphor by comparing the pile of coal to a killer with a rotten heart, which implies that the coal tip presented an extreme risk and sense of danger to the villagers because before the landslide, implying that the disaster was avoidable, but also somewhat predictable, and many people died needlessly. So the writer in this extract, if you read the whole thing, does suggest that this was going to always happen. It was an accident looking to happen. It was negligent to put piles of rubble on top of a hill where gravity can easily make it run down the hill and destroy everything. It's just, you could say, human error. So it was always going to happen, you could say. It was asking for trouble, and it did happen. So and that sense of predictability almost makes it seem worse because this was avoidable if they had disposed of this coal in a proper way. They probably put it on top of the hill to be convenient because they didn't have to take it far, whereas they should have taken it somewhere safer, not on the hill above a village. So that's contextualised. That's what that word is actually doing, or that's what that phrase is doing. It's presenting this coal tip as having an extreme risk and sense of danger to the villagers before, and then it happened. Then we go into zooming in to those individual words which we were talking about earlier. So the adjective rotten has connotations of something that is decayed or decomposed, perhaps someone who is corrupt, dishonest, and untrustworthy because of a lack of morality or empathy. Similarly, the noun killer suggests that the pile of coal had the capacity to cause great harm and destruction in a menacing and threatening way, conveying a sense of forceful malevolence and maliciousness, as if this coal tip is being personified as someone who deliberately set out to cause suffering on that day. So you can see that by then zooming in to that existing metaphor, we are able to really expand on our ideas and also think about the effects and the way in which this coal tip is presented. And that's something that students forget to do. They will just simply call it a metaphor and then talk about the whole thing without delving into the metaphor or the phrase. So the purpose of this presentation is to remind you that within an existing phrase there might also be important words to draw upon for some analysis. Number 4, as a result, the description of the coal tip creates a very emotive tone because of the clash between the predatory and malicious intent of the coal tip and the powerlessness and suffering of the villagers in the valley below. It's as if the coal tip is personified as murdering the villagers. So, yes, it's almost as if through using these words of heart and rotten, and also the metaphor generally, that this coal tip is almost has sinister intentions like a serial killer, someone who is determined and intent on causing other people, innocent people, great harm. Finally, in order to push it up even further, and obviously you can pause it if you want to, because it's a video, so you can pause it to read it and go back. But to finish off with some evaluation, this is an emotive phrase which foregrounds the evil and malicious intent of the coal tip and the impact it had on innocent people. The fact that the writer seems to predict this happening reinforces and intensifies the sense of sadness. So like we said before, the fact that this almost was inevitable makes it seem even worse because of human error. Had they not put the coal tip there, it wouldn't have happened. So that intensifies the sense of sadness and almost anger, I suppose, or bitterness that this happened. And when you go on to question 4 in this paper, talk about writers' attitudes, those words like bitterness or anger could be useful to describe the viewpoint or the perspective of the writer. So you can see that we've got another lovely detailed paragraph because we are thinking about these things in order, and we're thinking about them in almost like a formulaic way, and they all come together to create a detailed, quite thorough paragraph. And I've colour-coded it as well, so you can see the 5 components put together. So if we now take off our student hat and put on our examiner hat, and thinking about the mark scheme and what you have to do for the 12-mark question for paper 2, then what is effective about this paragraph? So again, I've colour-coded what stands out. So we've got yellow, we've got the quotes, and also the devices as well, so that is consistently used. We've got the contextualisation or the context in green there, which tells you what this phrase is doing, what is its job, what is it there to tell us. We have blue, which is nice vocabulary, which shows off the student's ability to be able to paraphrase, I suppose, or to summarise, or to use synonyms to comment on the effects or evaluate the writer's use of language. Words like predatory and malicious and menacing and malevolent, untrustworthy, decayed, does show a certain conviction and confidence with language. And then in order to finish off the paragraph, a high-level thinking skill evaluate, which really complements the writer. So you're saying that they wanted to present this coal tip as malevolent, and you're finishing off the paragraph by saying, well, that's exactly what they managed to do because of the words that are used. So this is an emotive phrase. It's a real extract that's going to cause people to, to feel sympathy and sadness with the casualties on that day, simply because there is a general sense that this was avoidable and it was human error and that caused it. So evaluate is a nice way to finish. What's also effective about this response is the words that I've underlined there. Words like implies, similarly, implying, suggests, as a result, conveying, foregrounds, reinforces at the bottom there. And those words are always useful because they are words that create some kind of effect or tell the examiner or signpost the examiner that you are thinking about the effects of language. So those kind of words that I've underlined as well often are very good words to use for an analysis question like a language question, for example. But they're also good for questions that require inference, like question 2, the summary question of paper 2, or the viewpoint question, question 4. So they are useful across multiple questions, actually. So in order to summarise them, the presentation, this presentation was to remind you that when you have a phrase that might be, let's say, 5 or 6 words long, don't forget to zoom into that phrase and the words that are in that phrase as a way of getting extra things to say and showing off the impact of words and phrases on readers. Remember that language questions enable you to show off your vocabulary skills through use of synonyms, and those were the blue words in that previous slide. Consider the effects of language, that's very important on the reader. Remember, you are the reader, and also to think about writer's intentions. So, why did the writer use specific words or phrases? How did the writer want you to feel about what is being described? They will get you to feel something by the words that they choose. So that is clearly a conscious decision. Think about the writer's intention. And as we said in the previous slide, use words such as conveys, reinforces, foregrounds, and suggests in order to talk about impacts or effects on readers. So that is the presentation. So in short, make sure that if you have a phrase that you don't forget that you can zoom into the words within that phrase as a way of saying extra things as well.